My sisters and brothers, our God is with you. A reading from the Gospel according to Luke. Jesus was teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and a woman was there who for 18 years had been crippled by a spirit. She was bent over, completely incapable of standing erect. When Jesus saw her, he called to her and said, "Woman, you are set free of your infirmity." He laid his hands on her, and she at once stood up straight and glorified God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant that Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, said to the crowd in reply, "There are 6 days when work should be done. Come on those days to be cured, not on the Sabbath day." Jesus said to him in reply, "Hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his ass from the manger and lead it out for watering? This daughter of Sarah and Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 years now, ought she not to have been set free on the Sabbath day from this bondage?" When he said this, all his adversaries were humiliated, and the whole crowd rejoiced at all the splendid deeds done by him. The Gospel of Jesus the Christ. We refer to this unfortunate woman, the main character of this gospel, as the woman bent over. It's not a fancy name. It's a little better than the woman with the hemorrhage, but it's still, she's not named like many people in the scriptures, the Christian scriptures. However, she was a person, a real person, but because she had osteoporosis, very, very severe osteoporosis, she was unable to stand. She was unable to look at anyone or anything except people's feet or the ground, because her face was nearly touching the ground. And you can imagine that through all of these years, 18 years, she was like this, and it just started, and just gradually, she was just lowered to that level. And she couldn't do anything about it. Absolutely not. I mean, we all know in times like that, there were no medical cures, there was no PT to go to, there was nothing that could help her. So she was shunned by the other people, yet she was at the synagogue whenever she could be and was there often, but had to be on the side with all the other women, actually, of the synagogue, because they were separate. The sexes were separate. The men were in the important area of the sanctuary, and the women were off to the side. And Jesus walked over to her, broke all the rules, and called her over. And by just acknowledging her, I mean, that was a real big deal, because she was not going to be heard any other way unless she came to the front. So he brought her to the front, and he actually touched her. He laid his hands on her head. That was very, very verboten, to touch someone who had any kind of an illness or a condition that was just different, made her different from anybody. The lepers, all those who Jesus ended up curing, were in areas where they were just set apart. But he actually put his hands on her head to the point where that was where she could feel. The story goes, that's not written in what I just read, but it's written and has been discussed over the centuries, that when she felt his hands on her head, that things just moved. She could feel this movement going up her spine and coming up to her head as she started to rise from the floor, to the point where she could raise her hands up and she could stretch her back for the first time in almost 20 years. And you can imagine what that stretch must have felt like. I liken the woman bent over to the women Catholics who are not allowed to be heard, to be present in any kind of leadership position, certainly not being ordained. My goodness. And like the woman bent over, I was in a position like all the other women Catholics who were not acknowledged for their gifts, for their talents, for their abilities to lead. And it was only very few months ago where there was one woman allowed to be part of the Bishops' Synod, which is the big meeting of all the bishops of the world at the Vatican. And of course, one woman is good, but that doesn't really count amongst all the men that were there. When I was a child, I was raised in a very strict Polish Catholic environment. Lots of rules, lots of thou shalt not types of things. And I never thought, never dreamt that there would be any possibility of being ordained, to the point where I never thought about that. I once thought about being a nun. That didn't last long. But I never thought about it. There are women in the Roman Catholic women priests movement who will talk about their call that they felt when they were children. They knew. They would practice being priests and give out Necco wafers for communion, and that was their thing. And I was never like that. It was only until I was married for quite a few years and had this knowing. I call my calling a knowing that something more was expected of me. And I couldn't really name it because there were no women ordained, of course. But I had this desire, this deep, deep drive. Drove my husband Gary crazy. And I went to talk to people of other faith traditions, other Christian traditions. I spoke with a lot of my friends who were Episcopalian priests, and of course they wanted me to go over to their side. And so I thought, okay, I'll go meet with another Episcopal priest that I don't know and get another opinion. And it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel right. Yes, the Episcopalian tradition is close, but it's just not the same. So then I met with a Lutheran minister, and it was the same thing. Close, not the same. And I did chaplaincy training in a facility that was owned by the United Church of Christ. And there were ministers who were not only of that tradition, but they were Methodists and a lot of other Christian denominations. And it was close, but it just wasn't the same. None of it was the same. And it was actually during that period when I was training for chaplaincy, which I thought was the only thing I could do with my master's in theology. it was during that time when, because it was, the facility that I was in was a continuum of care where you come in when you're a geriatric level, but you're not having any health issues, and you live in a cottage, and then if you start having some issues, you move up to another level, and then to another level, and then it's skilled care. And I chose that setting, actually, instead of just going to a hospital, because I knew the parish that I wanted to lead, I could never have. But at least I could have relationships with people that were not just coming to a service or going to something that is not where I would have one-on-one involvement. It just wouldn't happen. So, but at this facility, I could have that. So we were also, as students, the students that were in the groups, all groups for chaplaincy training are very small. We had 2 Episcopalians, a man and a woman. We had 2 Unitarian Universalists, a man and a woman. There was 1 Methodist man, and then there was the token Catholic girl. And we were, at one point, told that we need to perform services for the residents of the facility. And I thought, well, this is good. This is pretty close for me, get me to do something that I thought was a liturgical, somewhat of a liturgical setting. And one of the people in the group raised his hands, and he said, can we wear our robes? And that was like a dagger to my heart, because I knew my reality was I would never have a robe. I could never wear a robe. I could never lead a congregation. But there it was. So when the other students preached at their services, they all wore their robes. And I wore the closest I could do. I had a long black skirt and a white top and made it look as ministry-ish as I could. And I led the service not poorly at all. I think that I was right up there with everyone else, a little better than one of them. But it was a very painful thing because I was close, but no cigar. Just not really there. And so I moved on. I didn't continue with the chaplaincy route. I took other jobs, and I worked I was a speech-language pathologist for many years, so I did that. I did other things as well. But there was this nagging within me that I couldn't name and I couldn't help. And the discussions at our dinner table often went to that topic. And I know I was driving Gary crazy, but it's just, I didn't know who else to talk to. That's just the way it was. But at one point, I became very involved in a parish that had a conservative, not the conservative bent that I was raised in, but a very progressive atmosphere. And all of a sudden it was, oh, we're talking about spirituality. Oh, we're not talking about the letter of the law. We're talking about the spirit of the law. We're talking about having women take roles in doing whatever they could do. And I became a lector, which meant that I did readings. And I became a Eucharistic minister, which meant that I could offer communion to people. And that was all well and good. And the last parish that I belonged to, actually, I was, and this is kind of my little coup, I was president of the Pastoral Council, which was the biggest thing I could do in a parish. But of course, it wasn't what I desired deep inside. I would go to Mass. I was a very big Mass person. I wouldn't miss a Sunday Mass at all, and I often went to daily Mass. And the gospel you heard today, I'll bet so many of you who are the former or recovering or whatever kind of Catholic you were or are now, you know, it's all in the past. But going through all of that, you know that I'll bet if you were thinking about what this gospel was, you said, oh, I never heard that. I never heard that story. Well, of course you never heard that story because it's not typically used in the lectionaries at all. And I think it really isn't because it points out what I felt was very obvious, that women have no say in the Catholic Church. They just don't. So anyway, I would go to Mass, and I would be sitting in the pews, and at the time of the consecration, I'd raise my hand. I'd be sitting in the pews, raising my hand, and offering the bread and the wine in my head, you know, in my being, and in my gestures, but I was also wondering if anybody ever saw me do what I was doing. But it was just in me. It was innate. It was an innate feeling. And I would sit and watch the men at the altar. And with my degree, my training, I knew I had as much training, and sometimes more qualifications than the men who were on the altar. However, because I had this stigma of being a female, I could never be there. And it was so, so unjust. As much as Catholicism states that they are justice-minded, I laugh at that. And there is a hymn that I've heard they don't let that be sung anymore, and probably many parishes never sang it anyway. It's All Are Welcome. And it's a lie. It's a lie, because all are not welcome. If you're not Catholic, you don't come for communion. If you do, you said, you have to do this, so that you're marked as not getting any communion from the priest or the Eucharistic ministers. You just don't, you can't get it. You can't. And so, one day, I was reading a publication that I used to get, the National Catholic Reporter, which is very progressive, as opposed to the National Catholic Register, which is very conservative. And there was a picture of a woman on the front, and her name was Jean Marchant. Jean Marchant lived in Framingham, Massachusetts, and at the time I was living in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I thought, there was a story about her, how she had been the head of all the chaplains in the Archdiocese of Boston, a very high-level position. Not a liturgical position, but a very high position in the Archdiocese. And I thought, whoa, look at her. Because the picture was of her after her ordination to priesthood. I thought, whoa, she's only in Framingham, and I'm in Manchester. It's about an hour away. I could at least talk to her. Just talk to her, see what this is all about. I had never heard of Roman Catholic women priests. Catholics haven't heard of Roman Catholic women priests. I mean, it's just not, it's not there. There's no way to get the name out. It just isn't. We don't have any resources to do things like that. Anyway, I met with Jean. She knew almost immediately that I was called to serve as a priest. And we talked about Roman Catholic women priests. And in a very quick time, I put my name in for candidacy to be ordained a deacon. In the Catholic tradition, you're ordained a deacon before you're ordained a priest. So there are two ordinations. And during this time, it was a lot of discerning. I had to sit and think, is this really what I want? Because I knew at that period of time, I had been the director of development for New Hampshire Catholic Charities, which meant my office was in the same building as the diocese. with the bishop and all the bishop's people. And I knew most of the people in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a small state, so it's one diocese. So I was known by the priests all over the state because of my very, very visible position. I was the fundraising marketing person. And being there also brought me in contact with things that I knew I couldn't have. And I knew that if I was ordained, that I would lose things that I had gained through the years. I couldn't be the person that I was. I was going to have to change. I couldn't be known as one thing or another. I was going to be labeled. It was like wearing the scarlet letter. I was going to be different from the other people. But I thought at one point, you know, there is so much I'm going to have to give up. I'm going to have to give up the things that I love about the Catholic Church. And I love so many things about the Catholic Church. Not the injustices, not all the horrible crimes that the church has put upon people throughout the centuries. I didn't love any of that. However, I loved the liturgies. I loved the music, the bells and the smells, the incense. I loved all of that. I just loved it. I loved it since I was a little girl. And I said, oh, gosh, I don't know. It's going to put me in a whole different place. And I went back to St. Michael's College in Vermont, where I had gotten my theology degree. And I talked to the other students, and I talked to my professors, and I said, what do you think? What do you think? And everybody said, well, it's a great idea, but who are you going to serve? And I said, well, there's so many who have left the Catholic Church. I'll serve them. I know I can serve them because there's so many. Well, okay, that gave me a little bit of hope, and it just didn't feel right at one point. It just didn't feel right, and I couldn't name it. I couldn't name why. I just couldn't. But the doubt overcame my desire to be ordained. I said, I'm going to lose friends. I'm going to lose the way I always had been. I'm going to lose all these things that my whole life had been about. I was going to be different. And I said, okay, I'm going to give this a rest. And I took my name out of candidacy. I was no longer going to be considered ordained as a deacon and then on to a priest, not ordained as anything. And one day, I was at Mass, and I was sitting in a pew by myself, and pertinent to this story is that I have no hearing in my left ear, and I never have. And I absolutely cannot tell you where a sound comes from. If Gary knocks on a window outside, I go to the front door, because I just don't know. I just don't know where the sound comes from. So that day, it was a Sunday, and my friend Paul, who's a Monsignor, was celebrating the Mass, and once again, the hands are going up, and all of these things that I do in the pews. And at that time, I heard from behind me, where no one was sitting, and no one was sitting in front of me, and no one was here, no one was there. So I didn't have to look around for the sound. I heard a voice behind me that said, "Don't deny me your prayers." And other than being excited because I could hear something, and I knew where it came from. I thought, I never, ever, ever expected that if I didn't go through with ordination, that I would be holding something away from God. I would be denying God. Never, ever thought of that. It was all about me. What was I going to give up? What was I going to lose? What was I going to have to do? How hard was I going to have to fight? Never occurred to me. This is not about me. And I had to step back and say, somebody has to do something about this injustice. Why women cannot be seen like the woman who was bent over. And I thought about other people that I knew in the state of New Hampshire, and I could not find anyone that I knew or had heard about or anything that had what I had. They didn't have the degree, or if they had the degree, they didn't have training in public speaking. They didn't have the marketing tools that I had. They didn't have the leadership that I knew that I had been given those particular gifts. And so I had to say, step back, look at the big picture, and somebody has to do something. And so I called Jean Marchant up again, and I said, I'm coming back. I'm going to come back and be ordained. And so in 2009, I was ordained a deacon, and that was a ceremony all about me, which was kind of an unusual thing for me. And my mother was there because she died between my ordinations. So that was nice to have her there. And there were people there. I had a lot of sisters of mercy. My friends came. There were 10 of them, I think. And they all sat in an area where they couldn't be photographed, because if anybody who is any way affiliated with the church, the Catholic Church, is seen at an ordination, then, and especially any of the sisters, the nuns, or priests, or anybody like that, they would be dealt with. They would be dealt with. So there was a lot of fear. So we made sure there were, and to this day, when there are ordinations, there are special places for people who either work in a Catholic school, or they are a religious or an ordained person. They go to a certain spot in the church. Usually it's in a church. And so there they were, all these people supporting me. It was a wonderful thing. And at that particular ordination, I asked my friend Gary Katz, very Jewish, to read from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because God has anointed me. And he, very tall friend, and he said, the funny part was when I asked him to do this, he said, well, because I wanted him to read it in Hebrew. That's the key. I wanted him to read it in Hebrew. He said, well, what if I make a mistake? I said, we're all Catholics. What are we going to know? We're not going to know if you make a mistake. So he said, sure, I'll do this. And he got up to the lectern with the podium, and he slapped on his yarmulke, and he read that passage from Isaiah. And then he sat down, and somebody else read it in English, so people knew what it was that he was reading. And his wife was part of the small group who actually laid hands on me to become a deacon. And she's also Jewish. And my Protestant friend. And I had a whole mix. And that was just a wonderful thing, because I tried to bring in as many other people who had nothing to do with what I was saying yes to. After I was ordained a deacon, I was ordained a deacon in the town of Weston, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. And then I continued preparation and was ordained a priest in Rochester, New York. And at that ceremony, there was another woman ordained a priest and 3 women who were ordained deacons. There should have been another person ordained a deacon, but she worked for a Catholic school. And so she was ordained 2 weeks later in a private ceremony at one of the community, worship communities that was led by a woman priest. However, and her name is Marilyn, Marilyn had invitations to this ordination for herself. And so there weren't like people from all over the place, but there were people that she knew were going to be at this ordination. Somebody took that invitation and brought it to the diocese. And that ordination was on a Sunday, and I believe it was Monday or Tuesday that she was fired from her job in the Catholic school. And the rest of her story is that she could not find a job in anything for 4 years. She and her husband lost their house. They lost everything. And then eventually she was ordained a priest, and she didn't care that, but she still, they still live in rental now because they didn't have the money to support themselves. And that's an extreme case, but there are several extreme cases. And one of the very first bishops was ordained, and when she went back, she was from South Africa. She had worked when apartheid was, in South Africa, in Africa. And she went back to the sisters. She was ordained in Europe, came back to the sisters, the Dominican sisters, because she was a Dominican nun. And she'd been there for 40 years, and she told them that she had been ordained. And they said, well, you're out. And they threw her out. She had no home, she had nothing. They just got rid of her. And what her job was as a Dominican sister is that she taught seminarians how to preach. And she was never, ever allowed to preach herself. That's the irony of the whole thing. So, like the woman bent over, we have gone through a lot of trials. I have gone through a lot of trials. I have lost friends. I have lost acquaintances. I've lost people that I trusted that just, they are fearful of what will happen to them if they're seen in anything that I do. And one last thing to tell you that I was ordained in 2010 as a priest in May 1st. And in July, there was this big brouhaha in the Vatican where they equated any female who was ordained or who had anything to do with their ordination was viewed on the same level as the pedophile priests. So that is the bane of our existence. And so like the woman who was bent over, I was bent over, but now I can stand up and I can preach and I can celebrate masses and all these sacraments, which are baptism and marry people and confessions. Yes, I do confessions and all of the things that any other man in the institutional church can do. I can do all of those things. And I can offer communion that is gluten-free. We have gluten-free bread, and we have non-alcoholic wine. And so anyone who is a recovering alcoholic will still come and receive communion. I don't ask them what they are. Do you have a stated religion or not? I don't care. And there was one important, I forgot about my important person at my priestly ordination. which was huge because there were so many of us ordained. There was this woman that came up to me to receive communion, and I didn't know who she was, and nobody to this day knows who she was, but she was a woman. Well, of course she was a woman. She was a Buddhist monk, and I gave communion to a Buddhist monk, and I thought, Pope John the 23rd, the institutor of Vatican II with all the changes, would be dancing in the streets and embracing such an ecumenical gesture that had never been done before in any Catholic church. So I am in a place now where I don't have the fear. My friends don't have to have the fear, but only if they come to a Mass that's in a house, or come to a Mass that nobody can see them, because there is still so much fear, so much fear. There's so much fear in the Catholic tradition that you have to follow the rules. I don't say to people when they are receiving before communion, the Catholic phrase is, Lord, I am not worthy to receive you. By your word, I am healed. In my Masses, you will say, Jesus, you make me worthy to receive you. It's different. We are, all of a sudden, we're worthy. Can you imagine that? Born in the image and likeness of God, and now we have to proclaim that we're worthy. And I also don't ask people to bow their heads and accept God's blessing. I say, raise your heads, because you are created by God. All of us are created, male, female, all of us. We are all created equally. It's about time that we can do that. Thank you.